And we will start with Haakon Ikonomou, who's a historian and a postdoc at Aarhus University. And he's participating in a project entitled The Invention of International Bureaucracy, the League of Nations and the Creation of the National Public Administration between 1920 and 1960. And he will be talking about Thanassis Aghnides, a Cappadocian Greek who eventually became one of the people who worked for the League of Nations. His presentation has the title Between the Levant and the League, Thanassis Aghnides and the Greco-Turkish Population Exchange. Haakon, the floor is yours.
So, first of all, thanks to the conveners and organizers of the conference for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So, I've altered the title slightly, as happens when it's work in progress. It's now Between the Ottoman Levant and the League, Thanassis Aghnides and the Makings of a Hybrid International Bureaucrat. And the reason is that I didn't get further than that, so forgive me. So, the question, one of the fundamental questions of this paper is: how did an Ottoman Greek born in a provincial town on the Anatolian plains get a high position within the League of Nations Secretariat at the close of the Great War? And the paper seeks to answer this question and then turns to a brief sketch of what this trajectory meant to his work within the League of Nations, and particularly the Greco-Turkish Population Exchange. As you will notice, Levantines, their communities and institutions are everywhere in this story, shaping what eventually became a hybrid international bureaucrat. I'll come back to what that means. So first, a little bit about Aghnides. He was born in 1889 in Niğde, Turkey, educated at 3 religious institutions, studied law in Constantinople and Paris, and joined the Greek Foreign Service in 1916, and studied, composed, and reviewed music throughout his life. And this is a relevant bit of information, I assure you. He also had a rather extraordinary career. He joined the League Secretariat in 1919. He became the director of the disarmament section in 1930. He was Greek ambassador to London from 1942-3 onwards. He was Greek representative to the UN conference in San Francisco in 1945. Chair of the International Civil Service Advisory Board, which invented the Code of Conduct for all international civil servants of the United Nations. And he was also on the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions in the UN from 46 to 63, basically brokering where and when and how much money should be spent within the UN. So, back to the question, how did he get a high position within the League of Nations Secretariat at the close of the Great War? I answered this question through 3 exercises. First, I dig into his regional, religious, socio-economic and educational background to discover the makings of an elite cosmopolitanism laced with rural conviviality, Christian economism and Helleno-Ottoman patriotism. Second, the paper pieces together an important aspect of Thanassis Aghnides' worldview, taking offset in a concert review that he wrote in 1918. The review sees him struggling to reconcile his imperial background and his relatively newfound belief in a world society of nations in a transformative moment in world history. His thoughts, as it turned out, were very much in tune with the international order that was to come. Third, the paper traces Aghnides' road from Niğde, where he was born, via Marseille and Constantinople, where he was educated, to Paris and London, and finally Geneva, through the lens of mobilizing networks. The section decenters the agency of Aghnides himself and looks instead at the infrastructure around him, viewing his journey as a product of interpersonal webs enabled by the reach of imperial and diplomatic institutions. The argument of the first part, piecing together his background, is that for Aghnides, the turn of the century Ottoman Empire served as a kind of training grounds for both his Greek patriotism and his post-World War I internationalism. Born in a Turcophone Greek Orthodox town in mid-Anatolia, Aghnides soon moved with his relatively well-off family to the bustling cosmopolitan Beyoğlu district of Constantinople. He attended only the most prestigious religious schools. What is peculiar, perhaps, is the mixture of schools. First, the elitist Greek Orthodox Grand Patriarchal School in Constantinople, a hotbed of ecumenical thinking and a kind of wide-reaching Helleno-Ottomanism, which sought to secure rights for the Greeks within an accepting empire, but which increasingly supported the expansionist claims of the Greek nation. He then attended the French Catholic St. Joseph's College, also in Constantinople. He excelled in class, learned French, and got into music, particularly the flute. His cohort was full of Greek, Turkish, Armenian, French, British, Italian, and Polish students, and the college enjoyed close ties with the Francophone community in the city. Then follows a move to the US Protestant Anatolia College in the Pontic region, close to the Black Sea. Here he is exposed to a rather liberal Protestant curriculum and, not least, years of training in the English language. I chose to embed the analysis in a broader social history of Ottoman Greeks, specifically those emigrating from the Cappadocian regions where Aghnides was born, and the institutional history of religious and missionary schools in the early 20th century Ottoman Empire. And through this, I argue that Aghnides was part of a broad movement of Greeks from the countryside moving to port cities. Equally, he became part of the transnational elite of Ottoman and particularly Constantinople Greeks, many of whom would attend the same prestigious religious schools, study abroad, and play prominent parts in the Greek state in the interwar period. Moreover, the schools he attended were contested. The Ottoman state sought to minimize the presence of and power of these schools, building a modern state-run school system to outcompete it. The religious schools themselves became important sites, both for keeping up the Western imperial presence and for nascent nationalist movements. Aghnides' early years and background, then, form part of the broad story of the transformation of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of a world of nation-states. And for Aghnides personally, religion and religious conceptualizations of community and peace grew to be central parts of his internationalism for the remainder of his career. Now, moving to the second part, which tries to unpack his worldview as it looked circa 1918, just before the war's end, the creation of the League of Nations, and him being offered a position in the new League Secretariat. Here I chose a very different approach, studying and contextualizing a singular concert review penned by Aghnides in 1918, which revealed the ways he narrated and made sense of the world at the time. A crucial element was the potential to learn from the horrors of war. Vladimir Rosin, the singer whose concert he reviewed, had performed a captivating Russian song about famine and endurance, which Aghnides placed in the contemporary context. And I quote, "In these days of unprecedented rage and misery, we feel particularly alive to such sentiments of horror. Drawn out sufferings has rendered us more thoughtful, receptive, and responsive. This is certainly not the bad side of the war." Aghnides, in short, awaited a moment to heal and make a better world, to quote Michael Jackson. Another crucial component of the review was his analysis of a Greek lullaby Rosin performed. Aghnides' verdict on the modern interpretation of this lullaby was that it brought a Byzantine musical culture ruined by centuries of thraldom under the Ottomans, back to life, and that this could only be done with solid instruction in the science of modern music and composition, to quote him, to merge its oriental rhythms and tonalities with occidental musical theories. One cannot help but read a passionate embrace of the nation-state into the review, and an articulate disdain of Ottoman tutelage. Greece was part of a brotherhood of nations and in need of enlightenment, he said. While steeped in Hegelian imagery, Aghnides' vision was first and foremost of a liberal's land, where education, modernization and science were tools of musical enlightenment, which in turn was but one strand in the civilizing of the Greek nation itself. Aghnides, in short, displayed complex understandings of the nation-state, empire, internationalism and the world to come, which aligned with the intellectual and indeed religious underpinnings of the League of Nations. The last section of the paper tries to retrace the steps that led Aghnides to wander the streets of Paris, unemployed and looking for work in the spring of 1919, and to uncover the networks that led him to Sir Eric Drummond, the first Secretary General of the League of Nations. What I found was that British imperial networks were crucial. Following the education at 3 religious schools, Aghnides studied law in Constantinople. Due to his knowledge in French and English, he was soon drawn into the city's polyglot diplomatic scene. He first became trainee of Sir Edwin Peirce, president of the European Bar of the Consular Courts at the port. Peirce had very close ties to the US missionaries in the Ottoman Empire and was close with the president of Anatolian College. While working for Peirce, Aghnides branched out and started giving Turkish lessons to British diplomats, among them a young Harold Nicolson. Aghnides then moved to Paris to retake his degree in law at Sorbonne and to enroll in the Musical Conservatoire. Here he was personally recruited to join the Greek Foreign Service by Greek liberal statesman and Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos, under the pretense, it should be mentioned, of wanting to discuss a concept review written by Aghnides. After 2 years in the Greek embassy in London, working as communications director, Aghnides returned to Paris. And here, the Paris Peace Conference was underway, and Aghnides, by sheer luck, one could argue, ran into his old Turkish pupil from Constantinople, Harold Nicolson. Nicolson was not only obsessively fond of Venizelos, he worked together with Arnold Toynbee for the Foreign Office Political Intelligence Department, feeding the British delegation in Paris with strategy papers on the issue of Greece and Asia Minor. Eric Drummond, meanwhile, as soon as he was appointed Secretary General of the League of Nations, started recruiting personnel from the unprecedented pool of diplomatic and administrative talent gathered in Paris, and one of his earliest recruits was Harold Nicolson. Thus, when Aghnides ran into Nicolson in Paris, telling him that he was looking for work, Nicolson immediately wrote to Drummond. I wish to recommend to you a young Greek who would, I think, be extremely valuable on the International Secretariat. I've known him for the last 6 years, as he used to give me Turkish lessons in Constantinople. I can guarantee that he is exactly the sort of person you would want, and I think it would be a great pity if we failed to secure his services. So, on Nicolson's recommendation, with a written recommendation from Venizelos, and with his traineeship with Sir Edwin Peirce uppermost on his CV, Aghnides was recruited to the League. Now, why does this make what I call a hybrid international bureaucrat? His affiliation and intellectual pedigree was a complex mix of imperial, religious and national ideas and concepts. Moreover, his education was a mixture of law, languages, music and diplomacy. His loyalties, interests and career were somewhere in between the Greek nation-state and the international, moving back and forth between international organizations such as the League and the UN, and various positions for the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Naturally, therefore, he was chosen as one of the key League officials to follow, coordinate and report on the Greco-Turkish population exchange. Now, I'm very much in the preliminary phase of researching this aspect of his career, but would like to end this presentation with a brief analysis of his report to the League of Nations on his first ever visit to Greece, Athens, to oversee the work done with refugees. Aghnides' visit to the refugee camps in the outskirts of Athens reconnected him with the world he had left behind more than a decade earlier. His empathy was clearly directed towards those who had a similar social background as himself. He was, for instance, particularly struck by those who had lived comfortable, even affluent lives in Turkey, and now had to resign themselves to live 4 people in a room and work to earn their daily bread. Quote, the Anatolian Greek Orthodox upper middle class, which he belonged to himself, had been uprooted in a brutal fashion and had lost their former purpose and dignity, he thought. And I quote, have been visited by a large number of industrialists, traders and professionals from Asia Minor, who are currently refugees in Greece. The fate of these people, especially those who belong to liberal professions, is really sad. Their capacities remain unused, and as most of these refugees left their fortune in Asia Minor, they lead and will lead a hard life in Greece. I spoke with doctors, lawyers of undeniable ability, who complained to me of the situation created for their class of refugees because, they said, they do not even have enough money to open a consulting office or an attorney's office, which would have, in a way, resettled them in their new life the war gave them. End quote. Aghnides thought them to have a lot of strength to show so much courage. His otherwise relatively sober report had suddenly turned nostalgic and emotional. So while pledging his allegiance to the liberal state, his imperial past tugged at his heartstrings. However, if we turn to the assessment of the work done on site, Aghnides commended the Refugee Settlement Commission, which he thought could not have done any better with the funds they had at their disposal. Refugees relocated to rural areas were doing relatively fine, Aghnides thought, while urban settlers struggled. With the aid of the League of Nations and the Refugee Settlement Commission, it was a conscious strategy of the Greek authorities to push refugees towards the countryside. Nonetheless, most refugees ended up in the capital. Athens and Piraeus could not absorb the immense influx of refugees into their social economy. Some would get a small amount, either directly or through the Refugee Settlement Commission, as compensation for the loss of property, to start a new life in Greece. Many, however, would have to make their own fortunes, and many did not. This did not keep Aghnides from a very positive assessment of the situation. The Commission was generally very much appreciated, wrote Aghnides, and the honour of choosing such capable men for the job belonged to the League. The population exchange, according to Aghnides, would in the long run strengthen Greco-Turkish relations. Once the transfer was done, Greece could pursue closer trade relations with Turkey. Aghnides then displayed none of the apprehension many of the jurists and delegates of the Lausanne Conference voiced. Not a few saw it as inhumane and immoral, and without a sound legal basis. It was, one could argue, in direct opposition to the minority rights that had been forced upon Eastern and Balkan states, new and old. Indeed, some jurists argued that the international community's approval was a sign of the decline of civilization. While appreciative of the scale of the calamity and saddened by the disappearance of a community he once knew, Aghnides, on the other hand, embraced the exchange as proof of a new dawn for Greece. At the time, Greece was embracing a new democratic system, transferring not only from monarchy to republic, but also, as Aghnides wrote, from the politics of personalities and clientelism to party politics of ideas and principles, and embedding itself in a liberal world order based on Wilsonian principles. In this ferment of ideas, Aghnides wrote, refugees play a very important role. Thus, his report laid bare all the complexities and contradictions of his trajectory and role. A hybrid international bureaucrat, calmly, only with small emotional cracks, reporting on the uprooting of his entire past to the international organization charged with overseeing the process, and accepting it as a necessity of a new world order. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Haakon, for this illuminating photography of Thanassis Aghnides, who probably was, along with Nikolaos Politis, the two most important diplomats who worked with or for the League of Nations, and with the issue, of course, of the settlement of the refugees in Greece.